Okay, so it just leaves me to introduce Sandisiwe Dhlamini, who is the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Lead at the Pensions Regulator. Sandy, do you want to give a wave so everybody knows who you are? Hello.
Hello.
And we are going to be talking today about diversity, equity and inclusion, following on from Pensions for Purposes Impact Lens research on how UK asset owners are navigating DE&I. The Pensions Regulator has also just published their largest ever survey, which was providing a baseline to measure DE&I progress on pensions boards. So we thought it would be good to set up a community interest group. We invited you all. I'm guessing that you're all at different stages of your DE&I journey, whether you're an asset owner or an asset manager or a consultant. And what we would like to be able to do is to drill a little deeper into the topic so that we can have an honest discussion about the challenges, the hurdles that are being faced when trying to embed DE&I into your investments. We're then going to try and have a discussion about how you think Pensions Purpose might be able to help you. For example, should we be running a masterclass to educate trustees? Should we be highlighting examples of best practice, setting out lists of questions for you to ask managers? What sort of topics should we be covering? Should we be talking about neurodiversity more, for example? Or would you like us to be undertaking a bit more research in a bit more granularity? Or perhaps it's a question of us putting together an industry working party to try and shift industry thinking so that DE&I moves up in priority in board discussions. So that's really the thought. This is our very first community interest group, so you're a little bit guinea pigs here. But just to sort of set the scene, we're going to have a discussion around some of Pensions Purposes research findings and also the findings from TPR. Okay, so that means it's time for me to sort of put some questions to Sandy, and then Sandy's going to put some questions to me. So we'll kick off with the discussion. So Sandy, just to start off then, why is DE&I important to the Pensions Regulator, and what have you done to try and understand and progress DE&I in the industry so far?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think we've been on a really long journey since about 2016 in relation to DE&I, and we have focused primarily on trustees. So it started with the trustee consultation back in 2016, and then we had the Future of Trustees consultation, which was in 2019, I think it was. And then we had the guidance that we published in 2021. And essentially, I think it's fair to say that we don't actually have the regulatory mandate to regulate against ED&I. However, we see it as a really integral part to a lot of the responsibilities that the industry has. So we think it links in for our trustees into their fiduciary duties because actually they have a really important role in managing the material and financial risks and the opportunity to act in their members' interests. So that's something that we take a keen interest in, and we think understanding and undertaking EDI related work is linked to that. And we also think in relation to the value for money framework and the work that we're currently doing and the changing markets, DEI is really important. And I think we all probably know and acknowledge that Gen Z, for example, are more inclined to invest in line with their values or consume in line with their values. So it's important that we're able to tap into that diverse kind of demographic. And it's more than just kind of, with automatic enrollment as well, we are finding that we've got a more and more diverse cohort of people who are now investing in pensions. So we want to make sure that all the savings are being made in the members' interest. So those are some of the reasons that the Pensions Regulator has taken an interest in EDI. And ultimately, it links to the, if we're coming at it from a financial decision, there's been studies previously by McKinsey and also by Forbes around the improved decision-making as a result of having diverse and inclusive decision makers. So again, that links into that. And then there's obviously the moral issue, which is kind of, it's the right thing to do. So there's a number of angles that make it really important for TPR.
And I mean, certainly thinking has changed, hasn't it? And over the past few years, even the thinking has changed on this particular topic for the better. So it
Yeah.
really is becoming an increasingly important area of focus for pension funds. So perhaps we should move to some of the key findings then from your survey. I mean, what did you find out?
So it was really interesting, and I'm keen to hear about your findings as well, because we found that actually we don't have as much diversity in terms of our trustee population. So the results were that 45%, no, actually 53%, over half of trustees were white, male, aged over 45, heterosexual, non-disabled, either Christian or had no religion, and not transgender. So 53% had 7 of these characteristics. And by contrast, we only had 10% had 2 or more of the protected characteristics. So that was interesting because it showed that actually we don't have as much diversity. And I think it was a good way to actually put figures to that, because I think we all suspect the industry is not that diverse in terms of protected characteristics, at least. But it's nice to actually be able to quantify that. The survey went out to and was responded to by over 3,000 trustees. So that was a very good number of people. But then most trustees were seen as diverse in terms of life experience. So that was 82%, professional background, 74%, cognitive diversity, and education diversity, which was 73%. So those were some of our findings in terms of the diversity. And then in terms of inclusivity, a lot of the trustees felt that they could express their true feelings at the board. That was 91%. And they felt that communication between trustees was honest and consistent in terms of ideas and suggestions. And they all valued diversity and inclusion overall. They saw the value in having diverse and inclusive boards and decision-making processes. So that was really encouraging. I think there was some really big contrast between the bigger and the smaller schemes. So for the macro schemes, there was they were less likely to view diversity and inclusion as important. So it was about 40% in comparison to the 80% of the master trust and the bigger kind of trust. And I think it also reflects just how much time, because they tend to be much smaller, they don't have as much resource. So actually, in the grand scheme of things, their ability to dedicate effort into EDI is limited in comparison to the bigger ones. But again, they also responded that it was good for diverse and inclusive boards were good for decision making. So it was quite a mix, but overall the trend is positive, and there is a real kind of commitment in the wider industry to progressing EDI.
Some pretty shocking statistics in there, though, weren't there, to begin with? I mean, I know when I first started out in the city, which, to be fair, was quite a while ago now, I was very often the only woman in a meeting. And it sometimes felt quite intimidating to then sort of stand up and speak up.
Yeah.
So I'm just sort of thinking now, sort of what do you think, or what did you find were the biggest barriers to progressing DE&I within the pensions industry?
Yeah, so I think for some boards, it was often an add-on. It's yet another thing that they have to do. And the message that we are trying to really drive is it needs to be part and parcel of everything you do. So don't consider it as, I need to do all of this. I need to meet all my kind of duties. And then I also need to do EDI. It shouldn't be an elective thing. It should be part of what you do. I think the data element is probably the most challenging, and hopefully this survey that we're able to do helps to move that conversation along around ways that you can collect data, the kinds of questions that you can ask, how you can utilize that data once you have it as well. I think that's a really big challenge. Generally, looking at what we found in the percentages that were kind of agreeing around the importance of EDI, like I said, majority of people recognize the value that you can get from creating diverse and inclusive organizations. I think the challenge is now the how do we do it, and how do we demonstrate that, and how do we make sure we can secure the investment to progress that. So those were some of the challenges that we identified in our survey.
And it will take time, won't it, to implement
Oh,
something?
definitely. It will take time. And I think it's quite interesting because you look at other industries, and for example, even the financial industry, and how kind of robust they have been with their commitments around EDI. And I feel like in the pensions industry, so at the moment we're doing the work with the professional trustees. Again, we are still finding the challenge in getting that diversity, because we are effectively kind of fishing from the same talent pool. So it's widening that and getting people to think about the skills that are required in a different way. So it's not just about the qualifications, but thinking about transferable skills, thinking about the gaps that exist. And our survey also found that actually having a chair who's really interested and committed to EDI makes a very big difference. So that's another thing that we are encouraging, the boards to consider.
I certainly, wearing a different hat, advise a local authority pension fund where the chair is passionate about DE&I,
Mm-hmm,
and it has just transformed the way they think about it as a topic. So
definitely.
what have you got in the pipeline? What plans have you got when it comes to DE&I at TPR?
Yeah, so we're continuing our engagement because we published the guidance and we published the survey findings. And through our scheme engagement advisors, we are engaging with different trusts to see how they're doing on EDI, identify any good case studies that can be shared around, and continuing that communication and conversation. Another key thing that we are now working on is actually understanding the causes of inequalities within the kind of pensions outcomes for people, and working with others who are working to eradicate that. So kind of doing similar work with organizations such as yourself to see what opportunities exist and how we can support some of that work, because we think it's really important to be transparent about those gaps and those challenges and those differences for different communities in terms of their outcomes on pensions. And because the key at the moment with the kind of fewer, bigger, better run trustee boards, which is what we are moving towards at the moment, is making sure that they're thinking about EDI, making sure that they're embedding EDI into the way that they operate. So again, I think we are probably moving towards a position where we are going to be expecting more because of in terms of our survey, our findings showed that actually the bigger schemes were able to do more, and they have the resource and investment which allows them to do more. And because they have there's a lot more risk as well within them. So we want to make sure that we're providing as much support as possible. So we're progressing with that in terms of our EDI strategy, which comes to an end in 2025. And then we'll be looking to refresh it, align it to all the changes that we've had happen within the regulator and the changes that are happening in the market, to make sure that we're still focused on the right things.
Lots going on, and I mean, I'm a great supporter of anything collaborative. When I set Pensions Purpose up, I wanted it to be a collaborative platform. So perhaps that's something we can come back to in our discussion, is how we can all work in the industry collaboratively to promote this topic. I know that you said that
Definitely.
you were interested in some of the findings from our research, so I'll put you into the questioner role.
Yeah, so I'd be really keen to know how the pensions industry is considering DI as an impact theme in terms of what were you able to find?
So the way we did our research was that we focused on 3 different areas. It's slightly different to your focus. It's complementary to the research that you were doing. We were looking at D&I in the pension fund's own organisation, which was where it was overlapping a little bit with your findings. We were looking at D&I in the third-party providers when they were going out to procurement to find asset managers, consultants. And then we were also looking at D&I in the underlying investments. So what was the approach that was being taken in terms of their engagement stewardship, for example. So I'm going to come back to that last point in a minute and focus on the first 2 in terms of some key findings. So in terms of pension funds' own organisations, the basic conclusion was that D&I is an emerging theme for asset owners. We had about 8% of respondents were thinking about it in the early 2010s. 15% were thinking about it between 2015 to 2019 and onwards, but for the remainder, they'd only really started thinking about it from 2020 onwards. So it's a relatively new theme, and I think there's a lot of learning that's still going on amongst asset owners. When we looked at the early adopters, They had good governance structures, they had sustainability policies in place. So there was a lot of the sort of groundwork had been completed, which was then allowing them to evolve further. And those who were developing further, they typically had started with gender, gender diversity, but then they were beginning to focus in on age and background, ethnicity, neurodiversity and so on. So they were starting to think about those things, but basically I think pretty much everybody had started by thinking about gender diversity. So when we looked at the third parties, what were they trying to find out when they were procuring for asset managers or consultants? They said that they were trying to get better representation on their own committees as a starting point. But when they looked at their third-party providers, and we interviewed some asset managers and consultants, 92% of them were embedding DE&I into their oversight of managers and consultants. So most of them were thinking about this when they were going out to procurement. 15% were delegating it to consultants in terms of procuring for asset managers. So there's a very important role for the investment consultants there. And a third of them said that they thought it was important that their providers had DE&I policies in place. So there was some groundwork there that they expected, some minimum standards that they expected with their managers and consultants. And nearly 40% actually included questions on DE&I when they went out to procurement in their procurement documents. Personally, I would have liked to have seen that to be much, much higher, because I think it should be on every procurement document. But it was see that some of them were at least doing it. So I think they were the sort of key findings, other than the sort of third section, which I'll come back to in a minute.
Okay, no, that's really interesting. And yeah, it does sound like it's really emerging, and it's great that some people have already taken that on board and started working on it. And then obviously you would hope that it can then be transferred across the wider market. That's really interesting. And yeah, in terms of the third, did you say you're going to come back to it later? Oh, okay. Yeah. So how important is DEI in the context of pension funds' wider RI approach?
Well, I mean, I said that they're on a journey, and I think it is still evolving. So that's the first point to say. It's still an early stage. But coming back to the key findings, with their underlying investments, generally, it was only being considered as part of a broader ESG due diligence.
Okay.
I think about 40% of respondents said that they were considering DE&I in their voting and engagement. And typically, you know, that would be wanting a certain minimum number of women on boards, for example, and voting against boards that didn't have that representation. Asset owners weren't yet consciously directing investments towards DE&I themes. Now, I think that's perhaps an example is how it's different in the US. So gender lens investing has become quite a big theme in the US, but we weren't seeing that in the UK amongst UK pension funds. But encouragingly, nearly 60% of asset owners were challenging managers on how they were integrating DE&I in their ESG policies. So I think that questions were being asked, and that's where it all sort of begins. You know, then expectations are raised and delivery is raised. There was one insight that on this area that came from the investment consultants. I mean, everybody that we interviewed on the investment consultancy side had a DE&I policy, but none of them said that poor DE&I in itself would be a red flag for not hiring or for firing a manager. So it's sort of feeding in, but it's not a sort of a hurdle that they have to get through or firing them if they fail it, which was interesting. I mean, I kind of hope this is really important, because we know that DE&I leads to better value, better governance. So I kind of hope that in time, perhaps it would be a red flag criteria, but we shall see.
Yeah. And I think as we probably progress through the journey, it's that moving from that nice to have add-on to actually it's integral, it's important, it's part of what we need to perform well. So it's really interesting. And also I found it quite interesting that, you know, with the ESG lens, I think we're a compliance industry, aren't we? We kind of look at everything from a compliance and what box do I need to tick. So again, as we evolve and get more comfortable with this work, I think we should see that progression where we just recognize this for the value that it can add rather than from, not perspective. Okay, and then what strategies have you identified in your research as initial steps for funds that are taking to incorporate DE&I? Are there any strategies you would cite as best practice?
So I think in terms of where funds were starting, I mentioned before that most of them started with gender because the data is relatively easy to collate on gender. And so that was, they then start thinking about, what criteria did they want? What expectations did they want when they were looking at gender diversity? And then they would sort of extend it from there. We had lots of examples of best practice, and they're all listed in a lot of detail in our report. But just to highlight a few of them, first of all, the Acetona Diversity Charter, that was definitely mentioned by those who were more progressed in their thinking on DE&I. Now, that is designed to provide pension funds with strategic guidance and inspiration on how to advance the DE&I theme. And they were using the Acetona questionnaire that the Diversity Charter has pulled together when engaging with suppliers. That's a really good resource. So any pension funds who I think aren't using the Acetona Diversity Charter's questionnaire should definitely be using it as a resource. A second example of best practice was the training that was being undertaken. So they were training trustees so that they understood the complexities of the topic and some of the challenges associated with DE&I. It's really, really important. They were embedding DE&I into their procurement processes when they were appointing new third parties, for example, asset managers or consultants. They were very clearly communicating with investment consultants how Acetonas wanted to, how they wanted to embed DE&I. So that clear narrative is that this is what we expect, this is what we want you to do. That's really important. That comes from having had the training, having had the discussion, having agreed what your policy is going to be, what your approach is going to be. They were thinking about their voting in stewardship policy, and those were being worked on. And when they were meeting investment managers in particular, they were putting DE&I as a specific agenda item into their meetings. I've referred to the client that I advise, and that is always something that they expect their asset managers to talk about at every single meeting. And they challenge them, and they look for improvements over time. So some really great examples of best practice, lots to draw on. There wasn't one fund that was doing everything. It was just the examples that we saw, but we thought it would be good to try and share them so that the industry as a whole can raise standards.
Yeah, no, and it sounds very comprehensive. I mean, a combination of all of those will undoubtedly lead to better outcomes. And I think it's really important to be able to showcase some of those because, like I said, some of the challenges that we found where people just don't know where to start, the desire and commitment is there, but they're kind of like, you don't know what you don't know. So I think some of those would be really, really helpful. And then what do you see as the major challenges pension funds are facing in implementing DE&I?
Well, I think limited resources is probably one of the main challenges. And you mentioned yourself that you saw a difference between the smaller and the larger pension funds. If there's just one pensions manager who's covering pensions and a lot of other things, there's only so many hours in the day, aren't there?
Yeah.
So I think that's an issue. And also perhaps conflicting priorities between E, S, and G. And environmental has probably dominated the discussion, the time spent. At the expense perhaps of S&G. And that I think is a challenge for implementing a DE&I approach. Data, I think, is definitely an issue. I mean, gender data is now sort of commonly requested, but asking for data on neurodiversity, ethnicity, for example, it can be a little bit more sensitive. And I think that some companies don't like to ask the question for fear of getting into tricky waters. Another challenge is that I think there's a bit of a danger it becomes a tick box exercise, and you mentioned this yourself, rather than actually resulting in meaningful change. And then also that we did see some inconsistency between different geographies. So the example I mentioned about gender lens investing, for example, US versus UK approaches, that's not a major challenge for a UK focused pension fund, but for a global pension fund with different offices, it might be,
it can be quite challenging
to get that consistency.
Mm.
So there we are. That's sort of a bit of a sort of summary of the research findings from our research.